So welcome everybody to ReSisters. It's Tuesday, July 30th, 2024. Well, where Christine and I are anyway, in Ontario, Canada. And Wednesday, July 31st, where our incredible guest is in beautiful Brisbane, Australia. So it's episode 96 of ReSisters. We can't believe we're getting near 100, but in some ways we felt it, in other ways we haven't. It's sort of flown, right, Christine? And it's specifically episode 76 of our COVID series. So it's a little different format than our listeners are used to. It's usually the live Twitter space, but we've decided to do a Zoom with our guest because we will do whatever path she would like to take if it meant getting her with us. So we're quite happy to be doing it. So I'm Mary Jo Neighbors, and I'm here with my truly awesome co-host, Christine Cooper.
Thanks for welcoming, MJ. So happy to be here. We have been waiting for this opportunity for a while, and I believe all things come to those who wait, right? So
that's a good
MJ, would you be so kind as to formally introduce our most distinguished guest here today?
Absolutely. So Dr. Lidia Morawska is a Polish-Australian physicist and distinguished professor at the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences and director of the International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health at the Queensland University of Technology. She is also co-director of the Australia-China Centre for Air Quality Science and Management, an adjunct professor at the Jinan University in China, and a vice chancellor fellow at the Global Centre for Clean Air Research, University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. Dr. Morawska's work focuses on fundamental and applied research in the interdisciplinary field of air quality and its impact on human health, with a specific focus on atmospheric, fine, ultrafine, and nanoparticles. She is credited with more than 950 academic publications, including scientific articles, book chapters, and conference papers. In 2018, she received the Eureka Prize for Infectious Diseases Research, as well as the American Association for Aerosol Research 2017 David Sinclair Award. In 2020, she contributed to the area of airborne infection transmission of viruses, including COVID-19. In that same year, she became a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and received the 2021 International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate Special 2020 Award for Extraordinary Academic Leadership. In 2021, she was included on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Dr. Morawska is a long-standing collaborator and advisor to the World Health Organization, contributing to all WHO air quality-related guidelines over the past 2 decades, of which we'll speak a little bit tonight. She co-chairs the group responsible for the World Health Organization's air quality guidelines, on which nations base their air quality standards. And we know that just recently, she was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So congratulations on that. Welcome, Professor Morawska.
Yay. Thank you very much for the introduction, for inviting me. It's great to be on the program.
It's fabulous to have you here.
So I think we have a Canadian connection, Dr. Morawska, do we not? I understand that at one time in your career, you were working or teaching at McMaster and the University of Toronto. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. It was, well, first McMaster, and then it was the University of Toronto. And this was actually a very important period of my life. I spent 4 years there, first as a fellowship of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that was at McMaster. And then I got a postdoc position at the University of Toronto. I'm a physicist, so this was still an episode of sort of more directed towards physics, and specifically physics of radiation, environmental radioactivity. My first degree is in nuclear physics, and then during my PhD, I kind of deviated from this core nuclear physics work to environmental radioactivity. So this was still work I was doing at McMaster and then at the University of Toronto. But at the University of Toronto, I had access to very advanced instrumentation by the standards then and still, to measure particles, detect particles in the air down to basically molecular sizes. And this was very important because studying radon and radon progeny, the radioactive isotopes in the air, it was very important to know what else is in the air, because what else, which means particles, in a way determined what happened to this progeny. If they attached to particles, they stayed in the air longer. If not, they deposited on the surfaces. So this was what I studied at the University of Toronto. But at that stage, I thought that science of radon in the air was somewhat exhausted. As important it is for our health, because if we inhale radon progeny, well, it's radiation exposure. But I thought science said the most important words about this already. So I was looking for something interesting. And then one day I took a probe from the instrument which I was using to study these interactions in a chamber out the window, busy Toronto street. And then I discovered, wow, such a huge concentration of this, what we call now ultrafine particles. I looked, searched for papers on this. There was basically nothing, because there were just a few instruments like this in the world then. And I thought, well, this is something really, really interesting scientifically, and from the point of view of what is the impact of this on our health.
No small feat. I'm sitting here listening to you when you talked about, imagine being in a lab and opening the window and putting a mirror and realizing there's a whole other field I want to move to. That's amazing. And from Toronto, you went?
From Toronto, I went to Brisbane, where I am now. So that was the stage I started looking what to do. I was a postdoc. This was a very good work and interesting group I was working at, but this was Department of Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't lecture there because I'm a physicist. So I was looking for other avenues. Whether to go back to Poland, where my position was waiting, whether to do something more adventurous. And then the professor with whom I worked at the University of Toronto, originally Australian, said, why won't you apply for a position in Australia? There's lots of interesting things you could do there. So I sent my CV to several universities, and I received two offers. One was from the Queensland University of Technology, where I am to this day, and never regretted this. So, but when leaving Toronto for QUT, I had my mindset that I'm not going to continue working sort of in mainstream on radon progeny or environmental radioactivity. I'm going to study airborne particles in the air with the focus on these smallest particles. So that's what I did. And since I came here, I established my lab, which is now for a long time called International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health. And that's from this platform we do all the work we are doing.
It's there are two things that stick out to me. One is that I was going to ask you, do you think that at the time that you decided that you're going to have your focus on airborne particles, that you'd be needing it so desperately, meaning during a global pandemic? Did you anticipate that something in our midst would come where you feel that all of that knowledge would have really come into play?
Well, I wasn't thinking about the pandemic then. As I started exploring the world of particles at the time, the most scientifically complex issues have been, and I guess still are, the smallest particles, nanoparticles, ultrafine particles, because of the processes in which they are emitted, they are formed in the air, depending on what the processes are, how they are detected, how to study them. Since we are talking about objects of molecular sizes, the smallest one, everything about these particles is very complex. And the issue is that these smallest particles, if we inhale them, they have a probability of getting deep into our lung and then getting through the epithelium to the system. Actually, new pathways are pointing out even to something else, which is penetration through the olfactory system to our brain directly. So this is the importance, but also scientific challenge. As I said, scientifically, whatever you do to investigate them is very complex. So this was what was on my mind. In terms of particles carrying viruses, this came a bit later. Well, for particles, whether this is a particle from this source or from another source, it's a particle, it's a physical object. So a physicist, I investigate particle in the air. Particles from our respiratory activities, and particularly those which carry pathogens, viruses or bacteria, are much bigger than those ultrafine particles. So initially we were not, we were doing a little bit research on this, but this wasn't our focus. It became our focus in 2003 during SARS-1 pandemic. Well, epidemic, this wasn't pandemic, luckily. The way it started is I was invited by the WHO to join a team in Hong Kong to investigate the outbreak in the Amoy Gardens. Well, by that stage, I was considered an aerosol scientist. So it's that, you know, that physicist, it was the name or the label kept changing. At the time, WHO had a team of epidemiologists studying this outbreak and couldn't explain it. The issue was that during one night, over 300 people were infected from one person who spent that one night visiting his brother. The question was, how did it happen? And we were talking about complex of over 20 buildings, high-rising buildings. How those people came in contact. Lancet published a study pointing out to some fast-running rats carrying this virus between the buildings. This was, I'd say, a silly idea. So, but the point was that it was impossible to explain this. So there was the team of aerosol experts who was going to investigate this. I was dreading the idea of going to Hong Kong at the time and was thinking how I'm going to explain that perhaps I can investigate this from Brisbane. But this mission didn't happen because by that stage the outbreak was over, so there were no there was no evidence on the ground. But I started looking into this topic, and to my big surprise, I discovered that over the span of 60 years, there were just 3 papers published from the point of view of physics of particles from human respiratory activities. And then I said, like that discovery, then that eureka moment in Toronto, this small particle, so wow, this is such an important topic and we know so little about this. That outbreak in Hong Kong was later explained by very unusual circumstances, which means that was a fault in the plumbing system and so-called dry floor in one of the bathrooms, which is not without water, which means stuff coming down the pipes was sucked into that bathroom and then by a fan in the bathroom outside. And then later modeling aligned the direction of this plume going around the complex of the buildings with the infections. So it was airborne, but it was a very unusual way of spreading. By that stage, I said, well, we should include these particles into our research as well. I applied for a grant from the Australian Research Council, got the grant, and was considering how to do it. Well, you can say, well, it's easy. You have a person in front of you, that person is coughing, sneezing, inhaling, just grab it and measure. But I realized then that the complexity of the process, that these particles will be very quickly evaporating, they will be mixed and old. So the way I designed that the whole study was to build a tunnel. Such a person sits in the tunnel with their head inside the tunnel, with slow air from the back of the head, and then downstream in the tunnel we measure all parameters we can using different instruments, many different instruments, because we are talking from the very small particles to particles, those huge particles you can see dropping on the floor of the tunnel. So this is what we did, including into this our colleagues, well, from outside our area, from respiratory physicians, to understand better the physiology of respiratory activities. So these studies are still quoted as kind of a fundamental knowledge on this topic. So they are particles from the point of view, as I said, of a physicist, particles, just different composition, different origin, but they are still physical objects.
I just love how you can pivot like that. I'm listening to you. I'm not a sciencey person at all, but I'm making notes and I'm learning so much. Thank you. MJ, do you have a question? Oh, can't hear you.
Of course, the Zoom. Both of us, Christine and I both lived separately. We didn't know each other then, but in the Toronto area during SARS-1. And we've spoken to we've had a few guests on about that time period. And then, of course, on to speak about the frustration really with what they learned after the SARS Commission report, and how it wasn't heeded when SARS-2 came along. You know, you've worked a lot with the World Health Organization, and we know from the general public standpoint, we've been just waiting for them to say airborne. We've been waiting for them to say the things that would cause things to get into motion. What has it, and to the point, I don't know how far you can speak to this, but you know, what has your experience been watching the maybe purposeful delay and you know, saying that blatantly to the world? Did you come up against obstacles in working with them to get them to the point where they would acknowledge it has an airborne component? We know that that sort of happened around 2021, and then we know in the new part of this year, they finally said, yes, here's airborne, and you had the ARIA tool and that entire assessment document. So how has that been for you? What's your experience been?
This question about me working with the WHO is a kind of multi-levels, because often people say, well, you've worked with the WHO for such a long time, but then it appears that you were fighting with the WHO. Something very important to note is the WHO is a huge organization, and they have different arms. And I never before worked with the arm responsible for this aspect, which is infection transmission. I always worked with the arms in Bonn and in Geneva, responsible for air quality. So there are different angles of this. So this was working with the WHO for decades now, has been, I'd say, one of the most amazing experience in my life, in my career, because the way interdisciplinary groups were brought, like, for example, to develop the latest edition of the WHO guidelines, which I co-chaired. How science has always been the kind of leading into all the decisions. Nothing could have been done without scientific consensus of these groups. So on the one hand, as a chair, for example, it was very challenging because I'm, as a physicist, leading a group, including medical doctors, epidemiologists, and sometimes I don't even fully understand what they are saying, yet I have to encompass this. So this was really amazing. Yet this was a different arm of the WHO responsible for this emergency response to a pandemic. I never worked before with that arm and never had any experience. Now, with how it started, I didn't really sit and watch what was happening. It came into kind of an abrupt decision what to do. It was the very end of March 2020. So at this stage, well, things were very, very rapidly developing. And that was a late Saturday evening, and I was on a WhatsApp call with a colleague from Italy, a close collaborator. Italy was at the time the epicenter of infections. And the number of people dying were something we were watching, this procession of cars, trucks with coffins. So this was really horrible. And the colleague said, well, his expertise is well, more in engineering than mine, but he has lots of colleagues in the medical area. And he said, well, all those people do what they are told, what's in the book, and yet they are getting infected and they are dying. So, but what's not in the book is that this virus, like any other respiratory virus, it was not a discovery during at the beginning of COVID that it was airborne. Like any other respiratory virus, this virus is airborne, and this was not in the book. So he said, well, why won't we, the two of us, why won't we write to the Italian authorities and tell them that this should be communicated to medical, to the nurses, medical professionals? And then I thought about this and I said, well, listen, Italian authorities will not listen to two scientists, even despite how well we are acknowledged in our scientific field. They will not listen to us. We must target the WHO. And this was the day before there was that tweet which came from the WHO stating the virus is not airborne. And I looked at it and I thought, how wrong can you be? How can you say this, that it's not airborne? It is airborne. So during this conversation, I said, well, this should be the WHO. And it occurred to me, I can do it. I can do it in that sense that I understand this, because it's different to advocate for something if you are not an expert. It's more difficult. I understand this field because I designed the science. I can do this. And I have experience with working with large teams. And I know colleagues from all relevant areas. So that was the decision on that Saturday night. Then I woke up on Sunday and I thought, do I really want to do it? I didn't then realize.
Am I crazy? Yeah.
Yeah, that was that thought. But well, didn't take long to reconfirm myself that yes, I was going to do this. And remember that day driving from home from somewhere, and I was looking at huge signs above the roads saying, wash hands, save lives. Washing hands will not save lives from infection from COVID. Well, how can you say a nonsense like this? Or going then to supermarket and seeing people with gloves but no masks, nobody. But as I said, it was such a nonsense to me, really. Then, so this was the decision, and in 3 days, I organized a group of 36 people. I drafted the petition to the WHO. I organized a group of 36 people, so that by Wednesday, which is 3 days later, by Wednesday, the 1st of April, I wrote to the WHO on behalf of this group. So this started this dialogue with the WHO, which didn't lead to anywhere. And by the way, I'm not disclosing anything which haven't been disclosed. This information has been published last year in the journal of CAD, the same journal in which we eventually published the petition with all the correspondence made public. So from then, the next 3 months were to what are we going to do so that it is made public, because the WHO didn't want to acknowledge it. We were in contact, we were exchanging emails, but the WHO didn't want to acknowledge this. So where to publish it? Journal, but what journal? Or a newspaper, like a newspaper sort of, well, it couldn't be a newspaper because our medical colleagues, public servants, couldn't be in this kind of a newspaper article. So two big journals rejected it, but finally it was accepted, and it was published on the 6th of July, which is basically 3 months later, after we started this quest. And the next day, during the press conference, the WHO acknowledged that there's emerging evidence that it's airborne. Well, all right, emerging evidence. That evidence was there all the time, but it was the acknowledgement. And from that day, from the 7th of July, things started changing.
We all saw that interview, that news press conference when Dr. Tedros was speaking and got interrupted, and they did the whisper in the ear, and he backtracked on the word. I think MJ and I, both our heads were about to explode at the same time watching that. Thank you for giving us that insight and your perspective. We'd like to talk about two other things today. I know we want to talk about Thrive. And first of all, I also would really like to thank you for writing this document. I don't know if you can see this, but I have been reading through this. I cannot tell you how valuable this information is to us. There's so much out of this that I want to pick through and share with other people. But let's start and talk about Thrive, because I've been reading through it, and I love the little bit when I read about we worry about what we eat and what we drink, but we don't care about what's in the air. How did Thrive come to fruition, Dr. Morawska?
When I think about this, it started very soon. The idea and the embryo for this came to be very soon after that July 2020 publication of our paper. Now, what happened then? There were basically thousands of emails I started receiving from people from all kinds of areas of expertise, of professional, including many people from kind of building industry, architects, medical doctors as well, but particularly those coming from the angles of doing something about the building, because it will become clear, and that's what we were pointing out. Well, it is airborne. We need to do something to get it out of the air, which means that's the role of the building. And that's again something we were saying before the pandemic, well before the pandemic, and we wanted to do something years before to how to better design buildings, ventilation systems such that it's not in the air. But this word that attracted the attention of many organizations, companies, and so on, who were writing to me, what can we do? How can we help you? And then I started thinking, there was that scheme, Australian Research Council scheme, called ITTC, Industry Training and Transformation Center, which required partners, so partners from academia, partners from industry, partners from any end users, to work together on training. So it's not that we are training somebody, we are training each other in a way and working together on solving problems. So I thought, well, maybe we should put an application for this grant. But it was very late. We had like about 1 month to the deadline. So we put an application. That application, my first application, wasn't successful in that year. But this gave us time to better build and bring this team together. So when we applied next year, we had a much better idea how are we going to work together, what areas to target, and what to do such that its science is then implemented in practice. This is the most difficult area. It is, in a way, for scientists, it's easier to do science, if you can say, do science. Publish a paper and saying, well, that's what we found, that's probably how it is, more research is needed, but these are the mechanisms and so on. But then if you ask, okay, how can we are going to implement this? Can we do this A, B, C, D? And then you think, have I taken everything into account? Is there anything else? And usually it is, because in practice, things are much, much more complex than one specific aspect, whatever it is. So then you need to have a very good understanding of the whole system and how it would work, because you may try to resolve one issue, but you will create other problems. So from the scientist point of view, saying, yes, in practice you should do, and it will work, and it will not cause problems, that's extremely difficult. But working together with people who have expertise and experience in different areas, and where we can discuss it all together, and we can see the system, complexities, potential consequences, and how to balance this, this is then what pushes the world in the right direction, applying science to practice. It's extremely difficult, because when we start talking between different disciplines, initially everything is clear. We are at the same goal. Well, clean indoor air, no problem at all. We start talking about this. But then we realize eventually that we speak very different languages of our disciplines. We have different understanding behind what some terms means, what some processes mean. So it usually then goes into that frustrating process. What are you talking about, really? It's not what I meant, before we establish common understanding and are able to push things together. So this is Thrive, and this is not just that one project we applied a year later, but it consists of 3 projects. I also applied in the same time for the Australian Laureate Fellowship, which is considered one of the most prestigious Australian Research Council's grants to an individual. And I received this, and there was also another project. So 3 projects in more or less the kind of the same space. Now, so there are 3 projects now, which I'm leading with a large group of people in this sort of general, the same area. Of course, they are individual projects, but they have to work together. So it makes sense to make a program out of this. We discussed with the ARC whether they're happy with this, that we put one name, and yes, they were happy. What name? So we started thinking about this one name. That's about indoor air, but call it indoor air something. Well, it's not fully indoor air, because when we are talking about buildings, redesigning buildings, not just indoor air. We're talking about buildings, it's not indoor air. We couldn't come up with a term. And then one day I aligned all these 3 titles of the 3 projects, and I looked at that laureate, and the title of the laureate is My Air, My Space, the Science of Buildings, which makes us thrive.
Oh, I love that.
Thrive. So this is really to make us
well
thrive.
done.
That's the name of our program.
I have to tell you, I love that. And partly because I'm a part of an organization in Ontario, Canada called Ontario School Safety, where we've been working for the last 2 years to try to improve the air quality in schools and on school buses to reduce, of course, airborne viruses, plus all the other great things that clean air can do. And that's one of the things we try to say all the time when we're talking to politicians and things, that really there's sort of like 2 things we feel we need paradigm shifts around in society, but also with leadership, government and school education, all that. You know, one we've talked, the buildings are the sick things. It's not necessarily our kids all the time. You know, having kids myself, you just assumed when they were little, they'd be sick. We'd all be sick. And oh my gosh, it's just what kids do and get. But learning that we've known for a long time that actually it could have been much less frequent illness amongst children, of course, amongst all the people who work with them and then out into the communities. So that people need to shift to say, you know what, actually, it actually hasn't always been our kids. It's actually been something we could have done a lot more about. So I think that is a big job for us, is to get people to see that that's actually the reality. And then the second one is that it's reasonable for them to expect clean air. You've often talked about, I know in your videos, you know, we highly regulate our food and our water, and although neither of those is perfect yet, you know, those things seem to matter. And if you told people that something had something in it, they wouldn't buy that week at the grocery store. But people don't seem to give air the same weight, for lack of a better term, you know, and that it is actually reasonable to expect it now, because we see, even with our own governments, we have the tools because they've improved their own workplaces. Right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's reasonable.
We saw the Davos safe thing, right?
Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate that. I just love that it's Thrive, because that's a word we often talk about, is we want our kids to be in places not just where they just get by, but where they're thriving, because most kids leading up to this date have done pretty well, considering how gross most buildings have been, but they could actually potentially have done way better. So anyway, thanks for that.
I would add here, it's not just reasonable to expect. I'd say it's our fundamental right.
Absolutely.
Thank you for saying that.
Absolutely.
That's how I put it.
I have used the hashtag clean air is a human right.
Yep.
Yes, yes,
I
that's
believe
right.
that thoroughly. Dr. Morawska, when I was reading through the material about Thrive, you talked about bringing together the community of science and the builders and the engineer guys. MJ and I, our jam for the last 3 years has been, we're all about educating at layman's language to the everyday people. I mean, I'm an old broad who lives on Georgian Bay. What do I know about this stuff? What I want to add to that is the component is bring in the grassroots people as well. You have taught us so much, and now we're taking that to the grassroots. What we're learning from you here today, we hope to take into places like Ontario School Safety with MJ and things like that. Thank you so much for that. I'm so appreciative of that. Sorry, I'm gapping here for a moment. I'm nervous. Sorry, I'm nervous. MJ. Well, I'm excited and I'm nervous and I have a broken nose and a broken arm. So I'm
we also tend to like to gab. So when we know we have a time limit, we don't know how to be short.
Because I feel like we're three girlfriends having a chit chat about air, right?
Well, especially because we came color coded, right? Yeah. And so, yeah, I think ultimately,
coordinated with these.
Yeah, right. So ultimately, Professor Morawska, I know, just like Christine had said, like we've been fortunate enough for people like you've been generous with your time. And we've also had lots of guests over time, like people I think like Dr. Orla Hegarty, Dr. David Fisman, Professor Kim Prather. And we've also had, other engineers, we've had psychologists, we've had behavioral psychologists specifically, talking about all the ways, all the interdisciplinary ways that we could better approach these things, because, it goes beyond, obviously, the science is what I think would drive the actions, because we need it to be correct, as correct as we know, as science changes, can change. But also we need, okay, so if we have this, like you said, how do we get it out there? How do we get it to people so that they hear it and it's important in their lives? Because that's not their wheelhouse. That's not what they're thinking of. They'll look at the news, the headline, okay, I'm good to go, no mask, everything's open, okay, life is fine, right? So for us, it's really learning how important it is to get all of those people involved, like you said, Christine, at the grassroots level too, because with their life experiences, seeing how, okay, I get you want us to do that, but here, this is the obstacles you're going to face, right, with this group of people or with that, right? So we find that pretty interesting. I think you wrote about.
I was going to ask Dr. Morawska, did you think in your lifetime you would see science under so much attack? I mean, we've seen the anti-vax movement and that rise of the disinformation train that's being just really mad. But I never thought in my lifetime that I would see the death of public health and science under attack. Like, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, this is something which I've been gradually realizing that this is the case. And I don't think it's been always like this. Or maybe I didn't realize. But I think it is more and more. And from whichever angle we look at, well, starting with climate change. Well, how long it took to get to the point that climate change is just basically accepted now. I mean, accepted by the society, not by scientists, but it's been decades since scientists were exactly explaining what's happened and what will happen if we don't take an action. From any angle right now is this denial of science. So that paper which I mentioned, which we made public, all our conversation with the WHO, its title is COVID-19, Science Rejected, Lives Lost, Can the Society Do Better? So rejecting science is something which we really can't afford as a society. This was, you mentioned that paper which we've just published in Science, that lesson 1, interdisciplinary science. When you mention science, and when you mention particularly science to decision makers, if you say, okay, there was a paper just published about something. So it could be that hesitation, all right, is that paper is what science in general is saying about this. Can I implement this? But that's the need for interdisciplinary science and then consensus of application of this science. So we've seen such consensus in relation to climate change for a long time. Interdisciplinary panel for climate change, which published report and has been publishing this report. So this is a consensus document showing this is what science is saying, what we need to do. So this interdisciplinary science, consensus, and then application of this, that was what I thought was lesson one. And if there's a consensus, rejecting this consensus by decision makers, whoever are the decision makers, is, I don't know how to term it.
Yes, it's been a difficult thing. Do you think that social, I personally believe that social media and internet has been a large part of the disinformation train, because I lived through SARS-1. I was in Toronto in the epicenter. This kind of dialogue that we're seeing now never took place. It was like, this is what we have to do. You lock down these hospitals, nobody goes in or out, blah, blah, blah. And everybody fell into lockstep on that. And they tamped that down in 6 months. But I honestly believe that the information that we're getting has been greatly tainted by social media. And the media itself has been a bad actor in much of the disinformation that's gone out as well. So,
well, in terms of media, I must say, helped us a lot in our quest then back in 2020 in spreading the information knowledge about airborne transmission. So media, from our experience, from my experience, through all this time, played a positive role. So it wasn't the media, it was more social media, but I see there's one fundamental problem that in general, our society lacks critical approach to pieces, well, information, whatever they read. So something comes via social media or whatever, and that's immediately, and particularly the more kind of juicy it is, yes, this is the truth. And the spread of this, that people have absolutely no critical approach to this, it's just phenomenal now. And flood of this, all kind of bits and pieces of information. So now my family and friends kind of laugh at me now that if anybody tells me something, have you heard that this and this? And I said, where did you learn this? What is your source of information?
Always ask that question.
And just we had a dinner with a close friend of ours during the weekend, and that person said about one type of vaccine, but do you know that this vaccine does this negative impact? Couldn't tell anything. I Googled later and found out that there was a Nature paper published a few days ago telling the opposite what that person was saying. So it must have been some bits and pieces on social media. Somebody heard something linking that vaccine with this impact. All right, it's negative. So it's then easy to believe, all right, if it's helping, if the vaccine is helping against something else, it's not anything. But if it's potentially doing something negative, we have to tell the whole world about this. Where did you read this? Where did you find this? I don't believe absolutely in anything anybody tells me until I find
until you write it. That's how
no,
did Professor Morawska say it was right?
until I read the origin of the information.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
You know what's going to happen now? When people say things to MJ and I, we're going to go, we'll check with Dr. Morawska and get back to you on that one.
There's a lot of confirmation bias out there, right? And I think because I am paying attention to the time, so we don't want to keep you much longer. But I know in light of a global pandemic, we talk about all the things that can impact this kind of behavior, trauma, global trauma. Like there are billions of people who've been really negatively impacted by a pandemic. And then we've got, just happens to be that, the way more political parties are operating, the shift toward autocracies versus democracies, the amount of money that's funding disinformation to meet certain ends, capitalism, like there's so many pieces to the puzzle, I think, that helps to explain why we're where we're at. But But I think that is why Christine and I, although we intended to do just a few COVID series sessions, that it's turned into so many, because there are so many people out there who really do want the information. And so whenever we can have someone as fine as yourself and credible and respectable, we are so very grateful for your time and you clarifying your perspective, because it's pieces that we would never normally have been focused on in our lifetime. Probably we would never have been talking about airborne particles with our family members if it hadn't been for this pandemic, probably, right? So we do greatly want to thank you for that. We did want to, if you have one more minute, do you have a minute, Preston?
Yeah.
We did want to talk to you about being a very long-standing, powerful, impactful woman in STEAM, and you know, how do we inspire young girls and women to get into it? And what do you have any sort of lessons you learned that you wouldn't mind sharing to young women and girls and save them a step of learning themselves? You know, what would you say to
old, and even some of us older girls?
Yes, that's right. Keep us going too. Yeah.
Well, when people ask me this question, I say, when I was a child or growing up, teenager, it never occurred to me that as a woman or as a girl, there's something I can't do. I guess it was part because of my family, my parents, both educated, and it was just obvious that myself and my sister, we could do whatever we want to do, and there was no division that men do women do this. It was such an obvious to me that it wasn't an issue. I remember a surprise when I was actually already in Canada, when a mom of my daughter's friends asked me, "Oh, how come did you choose such a not feminine profession, nuclear physicist?" What are you talking about? So as I said, this wasn't occurring to me. And of course, I realized, and particularly the more I was to my career from very different angles, of course, I see the problem. So it's not that there are no real problems and real obstacles facing women. And sometimes those obstacles are so kind of external to the person that it's very difficult to overcome them. But the first and the most important is that we educate girls, we bring up our daughters such that, well, the world is to what you want to do with the world. And the fact that you are a girl, well, you are a girl and you can achieve absolutely everything.
It's a superpower, actually.
It is a superpower. Why we're all coordinated together. We just Dr. Morawska, a very quick question. I just want to scoot this. Any thoughts or reflections on what's happening in Paris right now at the Olympics with all these athletes testing positive for COVID, particularly in the pool area? I was thinking to myself about the aerosol and the air in the pool area, and I thought, gee, I'd like to ask Dr. Morawska what her thoughts on that, because that seems to be the area that's where all the positives are turning up. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't really had a chance yet to look carefully what's happening there, but I was puzzled by this, and I would look at what's the ventilation there.
And your Australian swimmers, they're doing quite well.
That's right,
Yeah.
yes. Well,
actually, we saw the little girl who won the gold medal, and she had an N95 respi on.
Yes.
Dropped an F-bomb to the interviewer. It was a funny moment, but you could see her mask, like she was really.
She had just finished.
And she had just finished, and you could see that mask, like as she's breathing in and out, and it's sort of puffing in and out. And I thought, this is the way.
Yeah.
With this mask. Like, what a champion. That girl is a champion. Thank you so much for your time here today, Dr. Morawska. It has been such an honor and such a pleasure. And I'm like a little girl, like
little giddy, right?
Totally.
My pleasure. It's been really great talking to you.
Do you know what's really nice is, you know, as we look at your list of all the things you've been involved in and stuff, now you can say that you were on a ReSisters episode.
Yes, I will.
Thank you so much.
That'll
Dr.
be the last line of your bio, the next interview.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
So to all of our listeners, please, we'll be linking this to our YouTube channel and then all our social media channels. So please share this to help protect your loved ones and your communities. Let's keep mitigating for humanity because we got to do it. Thank you.
And we'll see you on the flip side.